moment this is, in 2018, to have this important conversation. The trade debate is in disarray. The political alignments that we've been used to for a long time are breaking down. And some of the conventional wisdom is under attack. And I think that's a good thing. And this is an opportunity for a fresh take on an old issue, and that's what I hope to bring you this afternoon. So I called my talk Sovereignty, Solidarity, and New Rules for a Changing Global Economy because I wanted to explore the common threads and some of the deep divergences between what's being called in this conference the populist revolt or anti-globalism, as represented by Trump and Brexit and the rise of a nativist and neo-fascist right wing, versus what I would call the part of the global justice campaign that I've been involved in for the last couple of decades, which is a progressive, pro-worker, pro-environment, pro-consumer, pro-democracy critique of the status quo. And that's what I call solidarity, the idea that when we are dissatisfied with the current set of trade agreements, it's not because we don't love people in other countries or want a set of global rules that will be good for working people everywhere. And so there's a difference, a huge difference, and that's the distinction that I want to make today. So my view is that the answer to the problems that we're facing are not in racism, isolationism, and xenophobia, but what we need to do is to find and build support for a new set of global rules that address the core failure of current economic policy, including globalization and how we've engaged in the trade debate. It's very challenging to figure out what is the way in which we can achieve economic and social integration in a turbulent world at this moment in time. We don't have a choice of not integrating. The year is 2018. We're the United States of America. We're not going to go back to an autarkic situation where we stop trading with the rest of the world, or people stop crossing borders, or ideas stop crossing borders. That's not an option, and it's never been really an option. And so the question is really, how do we find the balance between democracy and globalization? And sovereignty is an important word because sovereignty can be positive or negative, that as we engage in the global economy, there is a necessary yielding of sovereignty in the sense that you agree. Let's say you sign on to the International Treaty of the Seas. You give up some of your decision-making power, but you should do that in a way which is transparent and deliberate and that serves the broader good. And I would argue one of the reasons why trade policy has been so controversial is that we've done it in a different way. We've yielded sovereignty in a backdoor, deregulatory way, serving the interests of a small minority of corporate elite. And that's why it's so controversial, not because we're in the global economy, but because we've done it wrong. So I believe we need new rules, and we need new terms that will involve breaking down the conventional wisdom. Why do we trade? If we stop and step way, way back for a few minutes instead of just saying the words free trade and calling the debate over. We trade because somebody is selling something that we want in another country. But why do we have rules for trade? Trade agreements and the WTO, the World Trade Organization. We have trade rules because we need to set the terms for competition in the global economy, just like we set the terms for competition in the United States of America. Within our borders, we decide what is a legitimate form of competition. You know, you can't just burn down your competitor's factory or poison their well or hire child labor or dump your toxic wastes in the river. You can't do that because that's not a legitimate form of competition. But doing this at the international level is more challenging because we don't have a national government. We don't have a way of adjudicating when is the minimum wage high enough or not high enough, what's the right amount of environmental protection. And so these are necessarily difficult questions. There is no right answer to where we have that line, and what we determine is a legitimate form of international competition versus an illegitimate form. And I wanted to give you two examples that I think illustrate this. After NAFTA passed, after the North American Free Trade Agreement passed, Newt Gingrich, there was a debate about the minimum wage in the United States in the mid-1990s, and Newt Gingrich said, well, we can't raise the minimum wage in the United States because we have NAFTA now, and American workers need to be competitive with Mexican workers. And that was, I think, really telling, because during the NAFTA debate, Newt Gingrich and none of the NAFTA supporters ever said, once we have NAFTA, we're going to try to get your wages below Mexican wages. They didn't say that was the reason for wanting NAFTA, but it was clearly top of mind for Newt Gingrich. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. The other quote that I like was also in the mid-1990s, and was Renato Ruggiero, who was in the WTO precursor, I think, where he talked about the challenge of the World Trade Organization and what the goal was. And he said, we're writing the constitution of the global economy. And he was proud of that. And it sounds pretty lofty and exciting, but I might ask, and you might ask, hey, you're writing a constitution for my global economy, where's my vote? When do I get to weigh in on what kind of a constitution I want for the global economy? Or are you fellows all doing that in a closed room with the rest of your elite? So, if we're going to allow globalization to erode our social protections, make our fiscal policy less effective, we'd better figure out where international democracy lives. So, if the goals of trade policy have been actually to erode workers' bargaining power and to take away democratic policy space, that combination is deadly. And that's something, this balance between democracy and capitalism and globalization is, I think, the great question of our time, which is how do we maintain and where do we draw the line? And Danny Roderick at the Kennedy School has said, as a democracy, we have the right to draw the line around, to protect our social protections that we put in place and to make globalization subordinate to that. And yet we haven't really done that. And in the trade debates that we've been part of, we haven't really done that. But Joe Stiglitz also said something really interesting recently at the American Economic Association meetings in January this year, where he said, what if the redistribution that happens as a consequence of globalization is not an unfortunate side effect, but is the actual objective? And I think that goes back to the Newt Gingrich quote. So that's something I want you to keep in mind, but I want to just, as I leap into my big talk, to say a couple of things and to invoke Karl Polanyi as we talk about these forces. What Polanyi said is if markets are not harnessed in the broad public interest, if we don't achieve the kind of mixed economy where capitalism is tempered by social policies and regulations, then the excesses of the market will destroy both market society and democracy. And that was, he was talking about the 1920s and 30s where that was a danger, but I think we're in danger of that today. And Mikhail Koletsky also said, a mixed economy won't last. It's inherently unstable because capitalists will strenuously resist the policy interventions that allow shared prosperity and legitimacy. And I think that's an interesting point at this moment in time. If you think about how do we end up with a lot of the policies that were put in place, the NAFTAs and the deregulation of the finance markets and so on, is that the economic power of the Adelsons and the Koch brothers and so on have chipped away at the social safety net, at the kinds of protections, labor standards, and other protections that we put in place to make capitalism work better, to make capitalism more humane, to share prosperity amongst the top and the bottom and the middle. And if we take those away, what we're left with is Donald Trump. So I wanted to say a few words about myself and how I spent the last 25 years of my life. So I've been a trade economist. I was a trade economist at the Economic Policy Institute in the early 1990s, during the NAFTA debate, during the debate about the World Trade Organization. And then, as Indira said, I went to the AFL-CIO for another 20 years. And so I have been in the room. I have been in hand-to-hand combat over trade policy since 1991, around not just, should we have free trade or protectionism, which is a stupid question. It doesn't really exist. There aren't two choices here. There are an infinite number of choices How are we going to engage in the global economy? Who do the rules protect? And I've been involved both in terms of the negotiation of each of those trade agreements and being an advisor to the US government around that, but also the congressional debates over passage, which were pretty rough, and I'm covered with bruises and scars to prove it, and then also the implementation. And so I feel like when we say the devil is in the details about trade agreements, I live those details. This is my life, is fighting for stronger labor and environmental protections, fighting to weaken the investor state protections and the intellectual property rules. And yet, in the public debate, it often comes down to free trade versus protectionism, the simplistic, overly simplistic, unnuanced view, which I think I heard a little bit of this morning. So I just want to say I'm glad to be here because I think that it's important that we get a little bit deeper than just to think that there are two choices and Donald Trump is on one side and all the critics of NAFTA and TPP are on the same side with him and all the smart people are over here on the other side. I don't accept that. So back during the NAFTA debate, there's sort of a basic smug fiction, and there's sort of a sense that the critics of trade are maybe just the people who weren't really smart enough to pass Econ 101, like you just weren't really there. And you didn't get you were absent the day they did comparative advantage, that trade is good for everyone all the time. But the truth is that if you take Econ 601, you learn a little bit more about trade, and one of the things you learn is the Stopler-Samuelson Theorem, which is even in the context of neoclassical trade theory, even in the context of the very simplistic model that we have there, that there are winners and losers, that in a country like the United States, which is relatively abundant in skill and capital, that the likely losers will be what's called less skilled workers. And a lot of them aren't really less skilled because they work really hard and they do hard jobs that probably most of us couldn't do. But that's the term, and it's usually people without a college degree. And so the prediction of the economic model is that those folks will be hurt, that they'll lose jobs, their wages will be eroded actually mostly the wages were eroded as a consequence of opening trade for the United States with a country like Mexico. But that's 2/3, that was at the time, 2/3 of the US workforce. So you actually had an economic model predicting that you would have a disproportionate negative impact on working people. And that was ignored by people. And the way economists make that okay is that they say, well, it would be possible to tax the winners and compensate the losers so that everybody's better off. Sure, it would be possible, but that is a theoretical possibility and it has never happened in the history of humanity. We didn't do it in NAFTA. Not only did we not tax the winners and compensate the losers, we pretty much doubled down on the opposite, where we cut taxes for the wealthy and we cut social protections for working people. And we wondered why everybody's so grumpy. But on top of that, the basic assumptions about free trade, the basic easy assumptions, don't really fit the world that we live in. We don't have balanced trade, we don't have full employment, we don't have perfect competition, we do have a lot of externalities, we do have a lot of differences in social arrangements and labor market institutions, and the factors of production are not immobile. So if you pile on all of those things to the world, then economists, is all I'm saying, should be a little less smug. But what I wanted to say, the coalition that was formed around NAFTA was really interesting. And this is, I think, that was part of my job back then. It was broad and it was deep. So it wasn't just labor and environment. And during NAFTA, the environmental movement was a little bit split, but they came together later. But consumers, migrant rights, access to medicine, family farmers, small business, it's really like a prairie populism kind of coalition. And it's multinational. The coalition we built was Mexicans and Americans and Canadians, workers and environmentalists and consumer advocates, and all those countries coming together to say, this model doesn't work for us. And yet we're still dismissed as dopey protectionists. And back then, if you remember, there was also the contrast with Ross Perot, the great sucking sound, and Pat Buchanan. It was kind of an initial shade of Donald J. Trump, even back in 1991. But the opposition to NAFTA and subsequent trade deals like the TPP was principled and specific and solidaristic. That it wasn't about Mexicans stealing our jobs. It was about multinational corporations abandoning American workers and communities, treating Mexican workers badly with the collusion of the Mexican government, and trashing the environment in all three countries. The enhanced bargaining power that corporations got from NAFTA was used to weaken unions, depress wages, and bully governments into abandoning regulation of the environment. So that was the NAFTA was a template, and that's why the NAFTA debate was important, because it was the first thing sold as free trade that wasn't really free trade. It was the protection of investors and giving them the rights to sue governments over regulations they didn't like or that cost them money, and extraordinary protections for the intellectual property rights of some of the wealthiest companies in the world, the American pharmaceutical companies, and correcting the financial flows and not dealing with things that might have been important to jobs and communities like currency and rules of origin. The labor and environment side agreements were tacked on as an afterthought, and they were as weak as they were designed to be. But the biggest obstacle over those 25 years was the complacency and the arrogance of the trade elite in both the Democratic and Republican parties, with the full cooperation of the media, I think what people are calling the legacy media. There was a desire to lump together progressive social justice critics with Ross Perot, Pat Buchanan, and Donald Trump. And the false dichotomy that was presented, that you're either a globalist or a protectionist, and if you're a protectionist, you're an isolationist, a nationalist, and maybe a racist and a xenophobe as well. And the way the conversation went this morning, I heard populism used to lump together Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Those are not the same. They didn't have the same policies. They were both critical of trade. That's not the same thing as standing for the same thing. Bernie Sanders does stand for workers' rights, environmental protections, and a new set of rules for the global economy. So let's not confuse neo-fascism with progressive populism. So the U.S. economic policy over many, many decades, of which trade policy was a key element, failed working people. Not just since the recession and the financial crisis, but over many decades. And you can look at it, just look at the wage figures, which are extraordinary. If you take a full-time equivalent male worker, has not seen an increase in his real hourly wage since the late 1970s for 40 years. Now that's extraordinary. Somebody is working full-time, doing everything he was told to do, and still hasn't seen a real wage increase. And so even though things got cheaper, and there was tremendous technology improvements over that time, tremendous productivity improvements over that time, globalization is going great gangbusters, and yet those benefits didn't get to the median worker. That's a failure of tremendous proportions. And if you look at the last 20 years, virtually all of the economic gains in the last 20 years went to the top 10%, if not the top 1% or top 0.1%. So there are many reasons, obviously. Trade is not the only thing. I heard people say this morning, it's automation. That's a very comfortable fiction, too. Automation and technology and trade are connected to each other. They are intertwined as forces, but I would say it's not so easy to just blame technology. You also look at the concerted attack on unions at the state and federal level, the reluctance to pursue consistent full employment macro policy, the privatization, deregulation, failure to invest in social capital and infrastructure, the erosion of labor standards, including the minimum wage, the erosion of the social safety net, both private and public, the rise of finance over the real economy, and the wrong kind of globalization. So the distinction I want to make of the, I guess you can call it right-wing populists versus progressive populists, and this is, I think John Judas had a book about populism that I thought made a good distinction, which is there's populism which is just with two groups. There's the elite and the working people, and there's anger at the elite. That's one piece. Then there's a triangulation of populism where there's a third group, the other. And the other can be immigrants or government freeloaders. And if you are reading the dog whistle, government freeloaders usually means people of color. That's a dog whistle. And it's a classic diversionary tactic of not just populists, I'd call it demagogues or fascists. It's like the guy in a gangster movie who knocks over the fruit cart in the middle of a chase scene. He is distracting you so that something else more important can happen. The scapegoating of the other is evil, and it's effective. But it's effective when there are stagnant wages amidst the extraordinary growth of wealth on Wall Street, embodied by Stephen Mnuchin. So I want to just unpack Donald Trump versus my people, the progressive, solidaristic global populism. So Trump hit the high notes during the campaign. He talked about, companies are mistreating you, they're outsourcing your job. He talked about the trade deficit. He talked about TPP and NAFTA as being terrible trade agreements. Our relationship with China was messed up and based on elite interests. And he talked about enforcing trade laws. So all those things are similar to what critics of trade policy have said. But if you go underneath at what his worldview is, and then you look at what his solutions are, they are the opposite. So Trump's worldview is that the US is not competitive in the global economy because our taxes and our regulations and our wages are too high. So if we let him make us competitive, we're going to get there the wrong way. And you see that with the tax bill that we just passed, and we see it with his attack on regulations at every level, and you see it with his continued attack on working people. So that is the opposite of the kinds of fixes we need in the global economy. If you look at a progressive critique, you'd say we haven't. First of all, we have trade laws that don't allow us to address the unfair trade actions of other countries. We don't have our own industrial policy. We're not investing in manufacturing. We're not investing in infrastructure. We're not investing in education and skills in this country. We need to build up workers and their communities. And Trump also would say our negotiators are idiots. He said that a lot. And he was going to put smart businessmen in charge of trade negotiations. Well, I've been in this world a long time. Our trade negotiators are not idiots. They're pretty smart, and they're very competent. And the problem wasn't that they're stupid. The problem was they were given the wrong instructions. They had the wrong goals for trade policy. That's what we need to fix, not putting a businessman in charge. So let me get to the end, as I see. So the failure of economic policies over decades and the inability and the unwillingness of elite Democrats to talk about the trade policies created an opening for Donald Trump to get the politics right and to take advantage of a vulnerability and a vacuum that was there. Let's not let this happen again. So Matthew Goodwin said this morning, Democrats need a convincing economic policy. I agree. So let's put new trade policy at the center of a new progressive pro-worker economic policy with an unapologetic national strategy, prioritizing good jobs, strong communities, environmentally responsible production, including renewable energy and green infrastructure, and smart and fair trade policy. So I believe we can rebuild a progressive, transnational, pro-worker, pro-environment, pro-consumer, pro-democracy Grand Alliance, not just in the United States, but between the North and the South. And if I were Queen of the World, which I'm expecting to be elected to any minute now, I would say, in terms of our trade policy, it's actually not that complicated. We don't need a lot of new free trade agreements, bilateral or regional. The truth is that there's not a lot of juice left there. There's not even a lot of economic benefits left in the dopey free trade agreements that we've been negotiating. If you look at the economic projections, they're actually pretty lame, even when they're wrong and they're done wrong. So we don't need them. We do need to deal with China's unfair trade practices. That should be a top priority, including currency, and that affects other countries as well. We should enforce our trade laws, but we should make our priority going back to a multilateral new alliance, a multilateral set of rules, maybe not at the World Trade Organization. I don't know. The World Trade Organization is in paralysis and has been for quite a long time. The WTO is stalled because developing countries rightly felt cheated by the Uruguay round. I actually believe that if we went back to the table and we dropped a lot of the crappy corporate stuff that our negotiators have been putting into our trade agreements and our WTO priorities for a long time, we could have a more interesting conversation about labor and environment and community support and social safety nets and how those fit into a different kind of world. So let me wrap up. There are a lot of things we need to do domestically as well: invest in infrastructure and change our tax policy, achieve full employment, tame finance, and protect labor standards. But the whole goal, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, is that if you think about what's wrong with globalization as an attack on workers' bargaining power and democracy, then you have the road forward to reverse that. Because we need to figure out, in the US economy today, how do we rebuild workers' bargaining power? How do we strengthen unions and strengthen non-union alternatives so that workers have a real voice at their workplace and in the economy? And we need to have the ability, we need to claim sovereignty where we need it most. In industrial policy, fiscal and monetary policy, the ability to create and nurture good jobs, to protect the environment, consumer safety, and worker rights, and not the sovereignty that we've eroded in protecting corporate profits and corporate interests. So we can do that. And that's my optimistic last note. It is achievable even in a global economy, but only if we change course dramatically. We created these policies. We still live in a democracy, however imperfect, but we can change those policies, and that's what we need to do. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Thea. And I want to thank Thea for also giving us a very passionate argument that challenged a lot of the assumptions and arguments that we heard this morning. And also I could hear in the passion in your voice that you're telling people, don't lump Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in the same bucket of deplorables or whatever they are. That you know, the people who are against trade or not against trade for the or the current free trade system that we have are not against it for the same reason. So I want to challenge you on that and say, okay, that may be, but then what is your analysis of why Hillary Clinton lost the election? Is that the majority of, are the majority of Americans then either Bernie Sanders believers or Trump believers in your view? And was President Obama partly at fault for Hillary Clinton's loss for doubling down on TPP and doubling down on free trade if that's not what the American people want?
That is an excellent question, Indira, and it's a complicated answer, but the truth is that Hillary Clinton, I love Hillary Clinton. I worked with her when she was in the Senate. I have a tremendous amount of respect for her. She's super smart. I think she's progressive to her core, but she could not sound sincere around trade policy. It just didn't come naturally to her. And I did a lot of phone banking during the election to Ohio, to Pennsylvania. I talked to a lot of working people. I was at the AFL-CIO at the time. And they didn't believe her on trade policy. But she said
she was going to get rid of the TPP.
She said she was opposed to TPP. Bernie said it. Trump said it. Most of the Republicans in the primary said it. And yet, she didn't sound like she cared about it. When Donald Trump talked about trade, he really sounded like he cared. He got angry. He yelled and screamed. He used swear words. He sounded angry. He sounded energized. And this is, I think, what I would call the problem of the clueless elite. People talked this morning about the bubble. I don't live in that bubble. I live in Washington, D.C., but I work for working people. And so I was out talking to working people on a regular basis. The clueless elite doesn't really want to talk about keeping good jobs at home because they think maybe globalization is just inevitable. It's here to stay. There's really nothing we can do. And something's got the words free trade in it. It must be good because they did take Econ 101 and they know that's true. But I do believe that Barack Obama undermined Hillary Clinton by pushing so hard for TPP in his last year in office. I believe that was a huge blunder. I don't think he needed to do it. In the end, he didn't pass TPP, so it was a big waste of time and energy. He spent that year beating up on Democrats. He beat up on Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and Sherrod Brown. He beat up on Rich Trumka, my boss at the AFL-CIO. He criticized, that broad coalition of environment, consumer, LGBT, women, access to medicine, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders. All those folks were critical of the TPP. That was a broad base of the Democratic Party, and Barack Obama turned his back on them by pushing so hard for TPP, and it put Hillary Clinton in a bad position, where she wanted the support of Barack Obama, for obvious reasons, and so she never did sound convincing. But it was a self-inflicted wound. It's been a self-inflicted wound for the Democratic Party. I hope the Democratic Party does not continue to make that mistake.